Good evening, everyone. Now, tonight's speaker, Dr. Simon Elliott, is a good friend of the BRLSI. He's given talks here before about Roman history. He was hoping to be with us in person tonight, and hopefully most of you have seen the messages we put out on the website that unfortunately, because his wife has had surgery today, he was unable to be here with us. So he is, however, as you can see, joining us remotely via Zoom, which is one of the benefits of technology. Before I get on to Simon's talk, I just want to mention the next military history talk we have coming up, which will be on Monday, November the 25th. And that's a talk about the Queen's Dragoon Guards, also known as the Welsh Cavalry, and their time in Afghanistan. And that talk will be by a BBC journalist, Gareth Jones, who was embedded with that unit for a long time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And his talk will go into the history of the Welsh military in Afghanistan, which actually dates back to 1839. But there'll be a special focus on an event that happened in 2009 when those soldiers were attacked by the Taliban in what became an incredibly intense battle. And Gareth was there for part of that. So he'll be telling us about that on the 25th of November. So I shall now introduce tonight's speaker. As I say, Dr. Elliott is a good friend of the Brilsey. He's an award-winning archaeologist, historian, and broadcaster. He's written, I think at the last count, 19 books on the Roman world and the ancient world, and I'm delighted to welcome him to talk to us tonight about Septimius Severus and also his invasion of Scotland, which I didn't know much about, but it's fascinating. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Can you hear me all right, mate?
Yeah, I'll let them in now. Thank you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Great stuff. Okay, I'll begin. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me back at the fantastic, how did you pronounce it, Joe? Brilsey?
Yeah, BRLSI.
The Brilsey. Well, thank you for having me back at the Brilsey. So I've learned a new word tonight already. My name is Dr. Simon Elliott. This is the third time in 3 years in a row I've spoken to you, and it's an absolute delight to be back talking to you, this time about Septimius Severus. The last time I gave this talk, Joe, it was outside the Baths of Caracalla a week ago. So, I'm in good form, you'll be good to know, which is great because a lot of Rome, as you're about to find out that you see today, ancient Rome is Severan. So my talk is Septimius Severus in Scotland, the northern campaigns of the First Hammer of the Scots. I have a book already published about Severus called Septimius Severus in Scotland, which tells that story from 4 years ago, and have a brand new full fat biography called The African Emperor, The Life of Septimius Severus, coming out in the spring next year through Icon Books and Belinda Audio, because next year is going to be a very auspicious year for the Severans, simply because Gladiator 2 is coming out in about 2 weeks' time, and it's set in the Severan period, with the chief protagonists being Caracalla and Geta, Severus' sons. So the Severans are going to be in vogue. So I'm going to equip you now to fully understand this most warlike of Roman emperors. I call him the greatest Roman emperor. Severus had more legions than any other Roman emperor, 33. He expanded the territory of the Roman Empire to a greater extent, except for a very short period, than any other Roman emperor. And he was born in Leptis Magna in North Africa, and he died in York in AD 211. And so I'll begin. Yes, I'll begin. So I'll begin. So just to give you an impression of the Severan family, his own family, that is Septimius Severus on the right, famously dark-skinned. I'll talk about his ethnicity later in the presentation. That's his wife, Julie Domina, on the left, the love of his life, his second wife. His eldest son, Caracalla, who succeeded him, is below Severus, and then the Memorial Damnatio'd younger son, Geta, is on the left, because Geta and Caracalla really, really, really didn't get on, as we're about to find out. A brief introduction about Septimius Severus to start us off with before I go into more detail. So he was born in Leptis Magna in Tripolitania, that's in Western Libya, on the 11th of April, AD 145. He was the emperor from 193 to 211, campaigned in Britain at the end of his life from 208 to 211, died in the freezing cold of a British winter. which is an interesting story arc, given he was born in the baking heat of a North African late spring. Died on the 4th of February AD 211. He was the founder of the Severan dynasty, which ended when Alexander Severus was assassinated in AD 235, which is the event which ushered in the crisis of the 3rd century, a seminal event in Roman history where the Roman Empire nearly imploded, and it took the great Diocletian to drag the empire kicking and screaming out of that crisis when he became the emperor in 284. So Severus effectively himself was the peak of the earlier phase of the Roman Empire, the Principate Empire. In terms of sources, we're very fortunate with Severus. We have Cassius Dio, who was actually a contemporary of Severus. He was a senator and he wrote his Roman history. So he knew Severus and knew all the main characters he's writing about. We have Herodian with his history of the Roman Empire, the Historia Augusta, which is anonymous. And between the three of those, you can get a fairly good view from a contemporary perspective of the story of Severus. And then later Latin chroniclers also give some insight. And then in terms of modern sources, we have some excellent ones, notably Anthony Burley, who wrote a biography about 4 decades ago, which is still an excellent book. Shepard Freer, a contemporary, and then today's David Breeze, Lawrence Kepi, and Anthony Cann. Rebecca Jones is very important because she's a great expert on Roman marching camps, which are important to this story. And then finally, archaeology is very important to the story of Severus, because in the last 20 years, archaeology has begun to emerge, which actually backs up some of the things which the contemporary sources talk about, particularly what turns out to be a genocide in the far north of Britain. I call it Scotland throughout this presentation, by the way. Clearly, it wasn't Scotland then. In the book, I refer to as the far north of Britain. So let's get some context about what we're talking about. So when Severus invaded Scotland at the end of his life, and all the detail of that will come later. When Severus invaded Scotland at the end of his life, it was a brutal campaign on both sides. And 2 years, 2 separate campaigns, 209 and 210. And at the end of the 209 campaign, he thought he'd won, got his peace deal, called himself Britannicus, had coins minted. And over the winter, the Britons betrayed. So Severus ordered in the 210 campaign a genocide, which appears to have happened certainly in the lowlands of modern Scotland. And here, this is Cassius Dio putting into the words of Severus as he addresses his troops outside of York, which at the time was the imperial capital, as I'll detail, before the 210 campaign, and they going back on campaign. This is him addressing the troops, and he puts in Severus's mouth words from the Iliad, and this is Agamemnon talking to his brother Menelaus. So Severus says these words to his troops, according to Dio. No, we are not going to leave a single one of them alive, down to the babies in their mothers' wombs. Not even they must live. The whole people must be wiped out of existence, with none to shed a tear for them, leaving no trace. Which is fairly unequivocal, and it seems from the archaeological record, as I've mentioned, that the genocidal order was carried out in that 210 campaign, but I'll come back to it. So I want to start off with an introduction to Britain in the 2nd century AD to build us up to the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd, when Severus is at the height of his power. So I always argue that Britain was the Wild West of the Roman Empire, a long way from Rome, hotbed for usurpers later in the empire. In fact, Severus himself fought a usurper from Britain, and always with a very large military. I argue 12% of the Roman military and what's only 4% of the empire's territory, because the far north is never conquered. The only 2 times a serious attempt took place were under Agricola, subject of a new book I've just sent to the publisher, where I think Agricola in the late 1st century AD could claim to fully conquer the whole main island of Britain for a few months. But that's a subject for another talk. The second one is with Severus. So again, Severus set out his campaign goals, which he actually achieved. And if he hadn't died in York at the beginning of AD 211, maybe the story of the far north of Britain would be very different, as I'll talk about. Within this wider province of Britain, there's a clear divide between the south and the east and the north and the west, because of the unconquered north. If you're north and west, the whole economy is bent towards maintaining the military presence there. And then sequentially throughout the 2nd century AD, you have a series of campaigns which take place, usually interestingly, when a new dynasty or emperor takes power, almost as though they're trying to pick a fight and get martial success at the beginning of their reign, and they can always pick a fight in the far north of Britain. So this happens with Antoninus Pius, for example, who sends Lollius Urbicus, his governor, to push the northern frontier to the Antonine Wall. It happens with Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, and it happens with Commodus. And by the end of the century, Dio is starting to use the terms Mightier and Caledonian to detail the newly formed confederations in the far north. So therefore, what has happened apparently is that contact with Rome over a century has allowed tribal groupings north of the border, those which Ptolemy details, to coalesce into these two enormous confederations. The Mightier in the Scottish borders up to and over the Clyde Firth line, and then from the northern Midland Valley into the Highlands, the Caledonians. And there you can see them there on this map. This map isn't the base map I'm going to use at the moment. It's going to be a taste of what's to come. The yellow squares are Roman marching camps from the Severan campaign, but I'll detail that later. What I want you to look at is where the Caledonians and Mightier are, and note the Highland boundary fault, which is the Highland line between the Highlands and the Lowlands. Very important in this campaign. Severus himself, right, let me give you a more detailed biography. Well, he's born in Leptis Magna, and this is Leptis Magna in Tripolitania in Western Libya. This is the Severan iteration. When Severus did a tour, as I'll talk about later, through Egypt and North Africa at the beginning of the 3rd century, everywhere he went, and many of them I've actually personally been to, they did a real makeover to impress the new emperor, and I call it the Severan makeover in each of these towns. And this is the Severan makeover in Leptis Magnus. So you're looking at the theatre is Severan, the governor's palace is Severan, the Forum and Basilica is Severan, the brand new harbour is Severan. All of it is Severan. Leptis Magna is there, bottom right on this picture. You can see it sits at this time in Africa Proconsularis, which is this super rich province in the super rich region of Roman North Africa. Remember, North Africa is a full fat functioning part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is a Mediterranean empire. So in many ways, the bits which would look odd to them are Gaul and Germany and Britain, not North Africa. North Africa is one of the richest, if not the richest parts of the Roman Empire. And Leptis Magna sits there in the east of Africa Proconsularis, whose capital was Carthage. The Severan family tree. Well, Severus's great-grandfather was called Septimius Mesa, which gives you all the indications you need about his personal origins. His father was North African. His mother was Italian. His father was from Phoenician, Punic, Carthaginian stock. So Septimius Mesa is a Carthaginian name. So in many ways, Severus had more in common with Hannibal than he did with many of the Roman emperors. And it was his grandfather, Septimius Severus, who was the first to actually take the Severan name. The Severan name referring to the constellation, the plough, the Great Bear, or the Big Dipper, which is the constellation of 7 stars, which circles around the pole star and is visible most often, which was a magical constellation for the Romans, with 7 being a magical number. So taking the name Severus and Severan was actually a very deliberate act by this Carthaginian family in highly successful North Africa, they being successful themselves, to start styling themselves as being Roman. His father was called Septimius Geta, who was ill for most of his life, so didn't reach the heady heights his grandfather had. But then we have, of course, Septimius Severus himself, who becomes the emperor. First wife, Paccia Maxiana. Second wife, the love of his life, Julia Domna. Then their 2 children, Caracalla and Geta. Severus wanted them to be diarch emperors and rule together like Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius, but they hated each other passionately, as we'll see. That didn't work out. Caracalla ruled through to 217. When he was assassinated, he was replaced by the Praetorian prefect, Macrinus, very briefly, who was then replaced with another Severan, Heliogabalus, who was a troubled young man who assassinated himself, who was replaced by Alexander Severus, who was also a troubled young man who was assassinated himself, bringing in the crisis of the 3rd century in 235. So the whole dynasty peaks with Severus, one of the mightiest Roman emperors. So a chronological background to Severus to understand a little bit about this man. He entered the Senate. He was born in 145 in Lectis Magna, enters the Senate in 170, and then begins his progress along the cursus honorum, which is the career path of a Roman aristocrat. And he's highly successful. Okay, he's had a superb education in Rome, although he still maintains his North Africanness, which actually leads to a reset of the whole empire along North African lines once he becomes the emperor. But we're at the beginning of this process now. He deliberately, even though he could have spoken beautiful, perfect Latin, chose to keep a fairly guttural North African accent with his Latin when he was speaking. That's very deliberate, always trying to set himself apart and aside and above his contemporaries. Marries his first wife in 175, Paccia Marciana. He then he gets his first major posting, which is to become the legate, so the general in charge of Legio IV Scythica in Syria, which is an elite legion. It's very important for him because here he meets two figures who are very important for the rest of his life. One, he clearly meets Julia Domna, as we'll discuss in a second. But secondly, he also meets the governor of the province, who becomes his mentor, who is Pertinax, who is later the first of the 5 emperors in the year of the 5 emperors. Paccia Marciana dies in 182, and in 185, Severus becomes the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, which is the key province in central Gaul, a long strip running from the Channel Islands through to Lyon, Roman Lugdunum, and through to the Alps. And he's the governor there, and he then meets up again with his new mentor, Pertinax, who at the same time becomes the governor of Britain. In 187, Severus marries Julia Domna. Now, she is the daughter of the high priest of the sun god Heliogabalus in Emesa in Syria. And apparently, he's in love with the lady, and he writes a letter to her back in Syria. And then she clearly is fond of him. She agrees to marry him. She sails all the way through the eastern and western Mediterranean to Marseille, and then goes up the Rhone to Lugdunum, Lyon, and they get married there. So he clearly met her when he was early deployed to Syria. Caracalla was born in 188 in Lyon. Gita's born in 189 in Milan as they're journeying back to Rome, because in 190 he becomes a consul in Rome. But in 190, later, he gets a key posting which sets him on the path to become the emperor, and that's to become the governor of Pannonia Superior. That's important because it's the province which anchors the defences on the northeast of Italy. So it's on the upper Danube. It's absolutely full of elite troops at this time because the Marcomannic Wars have just finished, which are the conflicts depicted in Gladiator, the conflict depicted in Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, fought from around 165 to 180, and the Romans sometimes winning, sometimes losing, eventually winning. But they were run really close by the Marcomanni, who were a German confederation, and their Sarmatian Iazyges allies. So Severus, when he gets deployed there, he's guarding the northeast corner of an entrance to Italy, and all the troops he's got are elite veteran troops because they've been fighting in the Marcomannic Wars. So we come to the year of the 5 emperors, AD 193, which is not as confusing as it sounds. Commodus is the emperor, mad and bad. He's assassinated on New Year's Eve 192, 193 by the Praetorian prefect, by the court chamberlain and his mistress Marcia, all of whom find themselves on a prescription list and due to be executed early in the new year. So they move first. They try to poison him because it's New Year's Eve. He's been drinking all day, and Commodus survives by having a bath and sweating the poison out. But it's a very well planned assassination because the conspirators have a plan B, the plan B being Commodus's wrestling instructor, Narcissus, who is told, go and kill the emperor. So he goes and kills the emperor. So Narcissus has now assassinated the emperor. And the Praetorian prefect and the court chamberlain then go and knock on the door of Pertinax, who at that time is a city prefect in Rome, and ask him to become the emperor. He's expecting, by the way, to be assassinated himself because he's the only survivor of the 40 mentors put in place by Marcus Aurelius for Commodus when Commodus became the emperor in 180. By 193, the only survivor is Pertinax. So he thought it was his time, but no, he's become the emperor. So he becomes the emperor. But he's only the emperor for 3 months because he wants to be a worthy emperor like Marcus Aurelius. Remember, he is also Severus's mentor. So Pertinax at the end of January, end of the first month, is visited by the Praetorian Guard, who say, can we have some money? And he says, no, because actually he doesn't have any, because Commodus has spent it all. And they go away. At the end of February, they come back and they say, can we have some money or we'll kill you? And he says, no. And say, okay. So at the end of month 3, end of March, they kill him. So Pertinax is assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. And then we have this bidding process to become the emperor with the Praetorian Guard, which is run by a senator called Didius Julianus, who doesn't last very long. Word goes out to 3 other candidates for the throne that Pertinax has been assassinated. Clodius Albinus, who is the governor in Britain, Pescennius Niger, who's the governor in Syria, and Severus, who's the governor in Pannonia Superior at Carnuntum near Vienna. The good news for Severus is he's nearer by about 6 days. So he drops like a sword of Damocles on Rome with 5 legions, gathers the Praetorian Guard who'd assassinated Pertinax in the Forum Romanum, has them stripped, and then banishes them from Rome, never to come back within 100 miles. He then reforms Praetorian Guard with 10,000 of his own Danubian veterans, reforms the Imperial Guard cavalry and doubles it in size, marches into the Senate with the point of a sword and says, I'm the emperor now. And senators say, absolutely, whatever you say, sir. So by the end of October, Severus has become the emperor on the back of this lightning strike on Rome. But he's got to deal with Albinus and he's got to deal with Niger now, because in London and Syria, they're now making their own moves for power. This is Pertinax, incidentally, just so you know who he is. The image on the right was found in Luddingston Roman Villa and is now in the British Museum. Pertinax, by the way, served in Britain 3 times as a junior officer with Legio Six Victrix in York, as the commander of the Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall at Housestead, and latterly, as I mentioned, as the governor. The image on the left is of him as the emperor, and that is seen by millions of people every day in one of the corners of the Vatican Museum, which everyone has to walk past, and no one knows who he is. But to the Romans, he was a fabulously important figure because he was the son of a slave who became the emperor of Rome. And to the Romans, he was the story of the everyman, showing that everybody could achieve whatever they worked hard for in the Roman world. But now he's dead. Severus has become the emperor. So what does Severus do first? He deals with Albinus in Britain and makes him his junior emperor, his Caesar. He then targets Niger and some of the border states with the Parthian Empire in Syria and modern Iraq, and wins. Niger is now dead. However, at the end of that, he makes Caracalla and Geta, his sons, also Caesars, and Albinus realizes he's been played. So Albinus invades Gaul with all 3 of his legions and a Spanish legion, the 3 British legions and a Spanish legion, and a titanic civil war battle takes place at Lugdunum and Lyon, which Dio says is the largest civil war battle ever to take place in Roman history. After 2 days, Severus only just wins. He's almost killed twice, falls off his horse twice, but only just wins. And on the back of it, he assassinates or executes Albinus, has his head chopped off, sends it to Rome, tramples on his body ritually with his new mount, and then sends military inspectors to Britain. And it's those military inspectors in Britain who actually do something very important in British history while they're sending a message to the Londoners, capital of Britannia, that they better behave in future and come back into the Roman fold or there's going to be trouble. It's then that the land wall of Roman London is built by Severus to show how powerful he is to the people in the provincial capital. And bear in mind that Severan land wall becomes the medieval Roman land wall, becomes the medieval land wall, which still to this very day delineates the city of London, the square mile. So our square mile in London, this financial powerhouse in international business and finance, was actually delineated originally by a Roman emperor from North Africa. I love that fact. Severus then goes back to the east and defeats the Parthian Empire, sacking their capital Ctesiphon, something very few Roman emperors have done. So he's highly, highly successful. This is one of the most successful Roman campaigns in the east. In fact, it's so successful that in a couple of decades, the Parthians have been replaced by the Sassanid Persians. So it's this event which really cuts the knees off the Arsacid dynasty running the Parthians, the fact that Severus had so comprehensively defeated them. And then Severus does the parade through North Africa I mentioned, where he leaves his mark everywhere he goes. The forums are all Severan, the basilicas are all Severan, monumental arches all Severan. They're all still there. He then campaigns in North Africa itself, and again extends the frontier there before returning to Rome. And incidentally, Severus hated Rome. He was only interested in the military. He absolutely hated the senators because he had to force his way to power at the point of a sword. So he never trusted the political classes of Rome, hated being in Rome, was only there 4 times, and each time only for about 6 months. And then from 208 to 211, he campaigns in York before dying in York. So let's have a look at some imagery to put some flesh on that story. This is the beautiful section of the Severan land wall that you can see. It's the bottom bit, which has got the lovely Roman stonework and tile bonding layers, which is next to Tower Hill Tube Station. There's also a very good new museum on Vine Street just above there, where a much bigger section of this wall is actually the centerpiece of a new museum of this land wall. Well, this wall was built by Severus, became the medieval wall, delineates the square mile to this day. York's important to the story of Severus because when he was in Britain from 208 to 211, he turned York into the imperial capital. He brought with him the imperial family, Julia Domina, Caracalla, and Geta. He brought with him about 2/3 of the Senate. Crucially, he brought within the fiscus treasury, and he also brought within the Praetorian Guard as well. So this is the imperial capital for those 3 years. And we know from correspondence that much of the ruling of the empire took place from York. Incidentally, as part of this Severan reset of the empire, when he was in Britain, he replaced any senator or any governor or any legate in charge of a legion he didn't trust with a friend or relative from North Africa. So it's more like a hostile takeover, actually. And he was also very avaricious because he made sure that the Severan family pocketed a lot of the proceeds from their successors as well. So this is Severan York. You can see the legionary fortress at the top there, the Praetorium and the Principia in the middle. That's where York Minster is today. On the south of the River Ouse, across broadly the line of the bridge, which is the bridge today, you can see the Canaba civilian settlement. So the railway museum and the railway station. Whoops. Bear with me. Over here. So that's Severan York. We now move on to Carlisle. So very recently, there's been a spectacular excavation ongoing in Carlisle of a bathhouse, just north of the river, across the river from the Roman fort in Carlisle, Lugavallum. And it turns out it's a monumental Severan building built at a time when Severus visited during his campaigning in Britain. Possibly a major bathhouse, possibly a huge imperial mansio, but completely Severan. Even there's even evidence that the imperial architects on Severus's staff, who would have been from North Africa, were physically there because of a lot of the tiles used are of a North African style. So again, Severus monumentalizing his presence everywhere he goes, just as in North Africa. And to that end, even though Severus wasn't in York and Rome for long, 1/3 of Rome you see today, ancient Rome, is Severan. So let me take you through some highlights. So this is the Arch of Septimius Severus, which is there to monumentalize his success defeating the Parthians in his second Eastern campaign. You can see there what he really thought of the Senate, because that's the arch on the left. The building on the right, where I was only a few days ago, is the Senate House. So he's built his arch outside the Senate House to emphasize his power. Remember, there had been a gold or gold-clad quadriga chariot with he, Caracalla, and Geta on top of that monument, by the way. And indeed, the footings, the foundations of his arch are built atop some of the footings and foundations of the Senate House, the Curia. So this is Severus's message to the Senate: behave or else. In exactly the same way, building his wall in London was a message to the Londoners: behave or else. This is the Temple of Vesta, which had burnt down in the Forum Romanum in the reign of Commodus, rebuilt by Julia Domina. So the Temple of Vesta you see today is Severan. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, and most of that you see today is Severan. And that's the Severan rebuild. They're called the Severan buildings, actually. That's the view from the viewing platform atop the Severan buildings over the Circus Maximus. That's Severan. There we go again. And then if you look to your left from that platform through the shimmering heat haze, and again, this is where I gave my lecture, this same lecture a week ago, that's the Baths of Caracalla, which is clearly Severan. They should have been called the Baths of Septimius Severus because Severus initiated their construction. They were designed to be his gift to the people of Rome, clad in white marble, astonishing, huge, overpowering, overawing, popping as you approach Rome on the Via Appia. The first thing you see before you get to the Imperial Palace are the baths of what we now call the Baths of Caracalla, should have been the Baths of Septimius Severus. Also, if you were to look at on the right-hand side, you've got the Colosseum there. The top level of the Colosseum is a repair of the top level built by Trajan, which had a fire event. So the top level of the Colosseum is Severan. And then if you look here on the Palatine Hill opposite the Colosseum, you've got the Temple of Elagabulus, which is also Severan. That's me, a very happy archaeologist outside the Colosseum. And then a new museum, highly recommended if you, the next time you go to Rome, the Museum of the Former Urbis. The Former Urbis, look to your left. It was a map in marble in a temple in the Forum of Nerva, so close to the Colosseum, built in the reign of Severus. That is Severan Rome. And I was guide lecturing a group last week, and we were having great fun looking for where our hotel was in the fields of Mars, and we found it, by the way. Well, here you are on the Chelian Hill, so it's a 5-minute walk from the Colosseum as you walk towards the Circus Maximus on the left. The new museum there, that is all the pieces of white you can see there. They are actually surviving pieces of this map. It's the earliest map of Rome. So Severus was one of the great reformers of the Roman military, the first of the Principates, indeed. So I've got a bit of feedback there, by the way, Joe. So Severus was the first great reformer of the Roman military in the Principate period. So these are Roman auxiliaries, which are normal Roman auxiliaries, which are from the Arch of Severus. These are Principate Roman legionaries from the time of Trajan on Trajan's column. No, normal lorica segmented armor, square scutum shields, etc. Move to the mid-century, and these are the contemporary panels. These are panels on the Arch of Constantine, reused from an earlier monument to Marcus Aurelius. So this is from the mid-2nd century, again showing classic Principate legionaries. But we start seeing a change taking place. This is that's something that I made and painted. Figure towards the end of the century, you start seeing Roman legionaries begin to replace their pillar with spears in imagery. The reason being they're tending to fight more mounted opponents, and it gives them more flexibility. And also they start adapting the rounder shields, which you see with later Roman legionaries, because again, it gives them more flexibility. That is from the Arch of Severus. And also they start fighting denser formations as well. This is what's effectively a legionary phalanx fighting a Parthian king here from the Arch of Septimius Severus. And this is the full journey through to the contemporary Constantinian panels on the Arch of Constantine, where you get these classic late Roman legionaries with the spears and with the round shields. And that journey looks like this. You go from Marian to Augustan legionary, to early Principate legionary, to Severan legionary, the change beginning to take place, to these two later Roman legionaries. It's all about giving more flexibility and more reach when you're fighting more mounted opponents. Severus also, to my point, was such a fan of his military that on his deathbed, he's reported to have said to his sons Caracalla and Geta, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn everybody else." And that's all you need to know about Severus's mentality. Sadly for him, Caracalla and Geta didn't listen. So we now move on to Severus's Expeditio Felissima Britannica, which the Expeditio Felissima Britannica is the contemporary name given to Severus's campaigns in Britain from 208 to 211. He gets a letter from Senecio, who's the governor of Britain in 207, which says the whole island of Britain is in danger of being overrun. We need you, or we need more troops. And Severus gives them both. I call it the Severan surge. orders go out across the west along the Rhine and Danube, get ready to go to Britain, and vexillations start being stripped out of the legions along the northern frontier, ready to go and join the 3 British legions. Severus and his army arrive in York in 208 with the imperial family, etc., which becomes the imperial capital. Then in 209, his first campaign takes place in Scotland. I'll go into detail in a minute. Second campaign in Scotland with the genocide 210. Dies in York in 211. Caracalla and Gaeta return to Rome almost immediately. They hate being in York. They love living the high life in Rome, but they hate each other even more because they travel back separately, racing each other with their supporters and retinues. And by the end of the year, Gaeta's been murdered by or on the orders of Caracalla, bleeding to death in his mother's arms. They're the 2 protagonists in the new Gladiator 2 movie. Why did Severus invade Britain? Well, he was born in Rome. He hated that. We know that. Also, we know he thought Caracalla and Gaeta were misbehaving, so he wanted to keep them busy. We also have this famous poem by Horace at the time of Augustus, written at the end of the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, when Horace says, and it's unusual because Horace is usually eulogizing Augustus, but here he says, Augustus will only be a god if he defeats the pesky Parthians, the Persians, and the Britons. And of course, Augustus did neither. So the narrative here is any Roman emperor who could do both of those things would be better than the greatest Roman emperor, Augustus. Severus had already defeated the Persians, the Parthians, so he had a shot at it. Also, he was ill, so this was his last chance of military glory. He was suffering from a terrible foot condition, which many people call gout, but may have been a much more serious pulmonary condition. When he died, he was 65. Then you have Severus Senesio's letter, which some people think was actually a plant to give Severus the excuse to go to Britain. And then finally, often forgotten, what were the motivations of the Mysian Caledonians if they were attacking? Well, they may have needed plunder because the elites were a warrior elite of fairly new confederations that needed to be led to glory to keep them happy. And also the weather in the Severan campaigns in the far north was terrible. Now, remember, we call jokingly the weather in Britain changeable, but the Romans tended to sort of tell it the way it was. And they said the weather in Britain was wet and cold, always. So for them to say that the weather was unusually bad in this campaign shows how really bad it was. So there may have been a harvest shock, and so there may have been famine north of the border as well. So if the Mysian Caledonians had invaded, then they needed plunder and also food. What was in the Severan force? Well, this was shock and awe writ large. 57,000 men he gathered for this campaign, which is the largest force ever to fight on British soil. To contextualize that, the largest battle on British soil was probably the Battle of Towton in the Wars of the Roses, when on both sides together there were 30,000 men. Well, here you have one of the sides, the Romans, deploying 57,000 men who arrive on every port on the east coast, effectively forming the first Roman field army. What does it comprise? Well, it's the Praetorian Guard, which Severus had doubled, 10,000 men, 2,000 Imperial Guard cavalry, Severus's pet legion, Legio II Parthica, which he'd based near Rome while he was there after creating its campaign against the Parthians in the east. The 3 British legions in full, two Augusta and Caelian, 20 Valeria Victrix in Chester, 6 Victrix in York. 15,000 British auxiliaries, plus the vexillations I mentioned from the Rhine and Danube. And don't forget the Classis Britannica regional fleet. I never do because it was the subject of my first book. So I've got a huge fondness for the regional fleet, which at this time we're using Liburne, Byrene galleys like this, operating on the littoral coast of the campaigning theatre, in this case, closing off the coast in the far north of Britain and campaigning down the river systems as well. And this is one of my favourite pieces of archaeology, Joe. This is a Roman lead waster, so it's a half-finished lead ingot found. It's about the size of a cup saucer, found near Brancaster, the very early Saxon shore fort, from around AD 220 on the coast of North Norfolk. So this is a piece of graffiti drawn by somebody who'd seen a Classis Britannica ship in real life, which I just think's amazing. It just like pings through history to me. You can see the ram on the front, the foresail, the main mast, the shields down the side, the planking. Absolutely amazing. That is a ship of the Classis Britannica drawn by someone who saw it. These are all the principal ports on the eastern coast, which are all used to get all the troops and anything needed to support them into the campaigning theatre, the battle space, because logistics is a very important part of this campaign, given we're talking about 57,000 men. So you have fortified harbours at places like Bruff on Humber, on the Great Estuary in East Anglia, South Shields, at Wallsend, etc. And this is what they look like. This is Roman fortified harbour, the square building in the centre. This is at Caerleon, in actual fact, in southeast Wales. You can see the legionary fortress on the right and the famous, beautiful amphitheatre above it. But we're looking at the building in the centre, which is the fortified harbour. Significant construction. The key three bases for the Severan campaigns from 209 and 210 were at South Shields, which at this time has the number of granaries increased by 9/10. So effectively, all the barracks are converted to granaries. When you go to Arbea today, which is a fantastic place to visit, when you look at the barrack blocks, they're not. They're the Severan granaries to feed his troops in the field. Then when the troops, as I'll detail later, get to the Forth, they start the fort at Cramond and turn it into a huge fortified harbour. So this is Cramond near Edinburgh on the Forth, which becomes the second key site on the chain. And the third key logistics base, that's at Cramond, is at Carpow on the Tay. Carpow on the Tay, I'll give you a location in a second, but this is the Principia in a crop mark in the Severan fortified harbour on the Tay towards the end of the first campaign. And this is the view of view towards the Forth from the Tay. So you can almost imagine the Roman troops coming over towards the Tay, building the fortified harbour, which is in the ploughed field in front of you in the picture. If you walk over that field today, you crunch through Roman archaeology from the Severan campaigns. So here is our battle space. Severus is coming up from York, gets to Hadrian's Wall, the northern frontier, which he fully repairs. Then, having fully repaired it, the whole 50,000 men and the 7,000 troops of the fleet on the coast smash their way through the Scottish borders. And on the way, build 5 marching camps, the first at Newstead, which are the largest Roman marching camps in the Roman Empire, 70 hectares. Can take the whole 50,000 men. At this stage also, the Severan phase of Vindolanda is very instructive. Gone now is the Flavian and Antonine forts, and the Antonine fort is flattened, and then on it a street grid is built, and then Iron Age roundhouses along the Roman street grid, which many now interpret as being a concentration camp for captives from this Severan campaign in the Scottish borders. And eventually they hammer their way through to the Forth. Severus then builds a bridge of boats, 900 boats, then divides his force into 2. He sends 2/3 of the force, probably under Caracalla, probably with the British legions who are used to fighting in this battle space, along the Highland line here. And as they go past every glen, they build a glen block of fort to close access to the Scottish lowlands. At the same time, the Classis Britannica seal off the coast. And once it's all sealed off, this is in 209, Severus, with the 1/3 of his force left, probably the Praetorian Guard, Imperial Guard, Cavalry, and 2 Parthica, they go over the same bridge of boats, but instead of going to the Highland line, they hammer straight through Fife, get to the Tay, build Carpow. At Carpow, then they build another bridge of boats. They then cross into the Upper Midland Valley and eviscerate everything they can get their hands on. This is the most brutal of campaigns. And by the way, just going back one, all of the white squares are marching camps. And these are Roman legionaries building a marching camp, which the Roman legionaries did at the end of every single day's march in enemy territory. Very important because it defends you. It's hard work being a Roman legionary. You're marching for 6 hours. You're building a camp for 3 hours. You're making your bread. You're going to bed. You wake up. You knock the marching camp fort down, and then you carry on and do the same thing again as you progress on campaign. And because we can match the size of Roman forces to marching camp sizes, certainly for the Severan campaigns, we can be pretty sure we know what the route was because they've been so well investigated. That's what a Roman marching camp looks like. So basically, it's a temporary fort, but exactly the same as a Roman, exactly the same as a normal Roman fort. With its here, you've got the ditch. Here, you've got the wall. In this case, palisade on top of the bank. You've got your barrack blocks. You've got your principia. You've got your praetorium, etc. Just a temporary Roman fort. There's a very fine happy archaeologist there on the right hand side, Joe, which is me recording a recent television program about the Romans in Britain. For part of it, I dressed as a Roman legate, and there I am at the newly recreated Roman marching camp, which is near Wrexham, which is an absolutely fabulous site to go and visit. I highly recommend it. There again, we can put the names now to these various marching camps. So we know we go all together to the Forth, then Caracalla on the Highland line, the Fleet along the coast, and then finally Severus through the soft underbelly. And there you can see Deer Street, the key road that they travel through the Scottish borders, which this is going past Melrose near Tremontium, the Roman fort there. That is the Tremontium stone. So the Roman Flavian and Antonine fort in Tremontium is in the field behind the Tremontium stone, which is crunchy with Roman archaeology. The Severan marching camp, 60 hectares large, is the entire hillside in the background, which gives you a sense of the scale of the Severan force in play. Here you can see a Roman bridge of boats, which Severus used twice on the Forth and Tay, this from Trajan's column over the Danube. Here you can see the scale of the threat faced by the Romans in this campaign. It's a brutal, grueling campaign, by the way. It wasn't like Agricola with Mons Graupius at the end. There was no meeting engagement. So it's a guerrilla campaign. And Dio says the Romans lost a lot of troops. So you can understand Severus's anger when the 209 campaign was overturned. This is Arduk. You can see here 5 defensive ditches, Arduk being the anchor at the southwest corner of Caracalla's line of forts. And that is the view from the Gask Ridge, which is a chain of Roman signal stations. And you can see here the Highland line, and each of these is a glen. And where all the glens are, that's where Caracalla built his forts. What do we know of the campaigns? Well, the 209 campaign was this brutal, savage onslaught. There was no meeting engagement. It was purely guerrilla warfare. We know that the natives, Dio tells us, the natives used something called some kind of drug as an appetite suppressant to allow them to stay in cold, wet conditions for a long time, which has recently been identified as the heath pea. There were huge casualties on both sides, but eventually weight of numbers told, go back, in Roman favor. So the natives sue for peace, and the terms are agreeable to the Romans. You then get a story about Caracalla at the peace agreement when it's been signed, which, by the way, is the only time Severus rode a horse in this campaign because of his foot condition. Most of the time, he was in a sedan chair. And at the peace signing, apparently Caracalla drew his sword behind his father's back, but was stopped from attacking by the Praetorian prefect. However, all is well. The Romans have won. Coins and medallions to victory are minted. Severus begins planning an urban Mediterranean-style built environment in the far north of Britain. Severus and Caracalla take the name Britannicus. However, clearly, the surviving native Britons realized the Romans weren't going back as they'd done before they were there to stay, so they rebelled. And therefore, you get the 210 campaign, a complete repeat of the first, successful for the Romans, only under Caracalla this time because Severus is too ill, when you have the genocide. What's the legacy here? The legacy is that Severus dies in York in AD 211, in the freezing cold of a British winter in February. Caracalla and Geta waste no time in returning to Rome, and we know what happened then. The military force disperses because there's no political imperative to maintain a presence in the far north. So therefore, the border drops to Hadrian's Wall again, which has been refortified by this time by Severus. Intriguingly, Hadrian's Wall was known until the mid-19th century as the Severan Wall, because the earliest inscriptions translated from it were actually recording the Severan presence. Did Severus intend to stay in the far north? I think his intention was to incorporate the Scottish borders, Fife, and the upper Midland Valley to the Highland line into the province of Britannia. Was it worth the effort? Well, did Severus conquer the far north? No, that's a failure because he died. However, he did have a significant impact on the natives with the genocide, clearly, because for the next 80 years, there's clearly some kind of peace on the northern frontier, the longest time in pre-modern history, because Britain isn't referenced again properly until the Carousing Revolt towards the end of the 3rd century, it's certainly the far north. So in that sense, from a military perspective, it's a success. It has secured the far north. And the archaeological record now shows specifically that depopulation events did take place in the lowlands of Scotland after the Severan campaign, and reforestation did take place, replacing agricultural land. We also know that auxiliary troops were forced into recruitment in the Roman auxiliary units along the Rhine. So therefore, it looks as though there was this major depopulation event taking place. There's the very sad end to the Severan story here. I've given you a romp through the story of Severus in Scotland. There's Severus talking to Caracalla on his on his deathbed, saying, "Please be kind to each other and look after the military." And of course, they hated each other, and we know what happened next. Very sadly, of course, there was a really, really unfortunate end to the dynasties we've seen, but it was in the immediate aftermath of Severus's death that actually it was brutal, because you have Caracalla killing Geta and then declaring a memoria damnatio against his own brother. So his brother never existed. So therefore, Geta's name is removed from all the monuments to the Severans, including the Arch of Septimius Severus, which is here. This is a column on the Arch of Septimius Severus. The figure second left is Geta, face removed, never existed. And therefore, if he never existed, his Parthian captive, who he's holding, also never existed. So his face has been removed as well. A very complete memoria damnatio. However, the Severans are back in vogue because Gladiator 2 is out in 2 weeks, and it is set in at the time of the Severans. I happen to know somebody, by the way, who's seen a preview of it, who says it's a very good movie. So fingers crossed, because the Severans are back in vogue. And he marches on through my book, The African Emperor, coming out next year. I've got a couple of TV programs coming out in the next month, Joe, all of which touch on the Severans, in case your viewers and guests are interested in watching. One's on Severan Rome, which is on Channel 5, where I'm an expert with Dan Snow. And then another one looking at the Bay of Naples through the Severan period. That's me filming with Channel 5 in Pompeii, actually, which by that time, of course, was under lots of ash. There's all my contacts if anybody wants to get in touch with any questions for me and a few of my books. And Joe, I'm happy to take any questions from your guests now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon. I hope everyone enjoyed the talk. As I say, sorry Simon couldn't be with us in person, but I think you made up for it with an excellent talk there, Simon. Okay, do we have any questions in the room? I can, yeah, let me pass you the microphone, and if you could speak, hold it quite close to your lips, then the people on Zoom can hear you.
Thank you very much. I loved it. Great. But I was just, you referred to the Severus's enemies as Britons. Is that the, I'm not sure how to quite ask the question, but were the Britons north of the border, were they what we know as the Picts, or is that something completely different?
It's a very good question, mate. So the issue you've got is you've got a plethora of modern terms. So what I do in my books is I call everybody who lives on the main island of Britain a Briton, because then I don't get a question from somebody saying, but there weren't any Scots, etc. Clearly, I'm talking about the region of modern Scotland, but I use Britain as a catch-all for all the peoples of the main island of Britain. And in the book, I refer to them as the Britons of the far north, or the far northern Britons. The Picts is a great reference. The Picts are first mentioned actually towards the end of the 3rd century, sort of 284 to 294. Before that, the Roman primary sources called the Britons in the far north Maite and Caledonians. but I thought it'd be easier for people to follow if I just called them the Britons of the far north.
Okay, I've got another question for you, Simon.
Simon, thanks very much for your talk. There the emperor is on the far edge of the Roman world. How on earth did he keep control of his empire from York?
The distance it would take to get a message from, so it's a great question, a good point, and I'll answer it directly, but I'm going to give you context so everybody else understands. The distance it takes to get a message from London to Rome is probably about, at the fastest, mostly by maritime going through France and then from Marseille to Ostia, it's about 12 to 14 days. The distance it takes to get a message from Brindisi so from Rome down the Via Appia, from Brindisi, and then eventually getting to Antioch or Alexandria is between 14 and 16 days. So you're talking about over a month at the very, very best in good circumstances and good weather. Your point is very well made. Severus, however, took absolutely no chances. So I'll refer you back to my comment where I said, before he went on campaign, he made sure he'd replaced anybody he didn't trust throughout the entire empire with North Africans. And clearly it worked, because even Caracalla, having killed his brother in a brutal act, which should have shocked Roman society, stayed in power until he was assassinated in 217, so lasted another 6 years. So unfeasible though it is, it clearly worked.
Thanks, Simon. As you probably saw, we've got over 40 people who've joined us online as well. We have some questions from the online audience. First one was,
I recognise some good friends there, so all friends who've joined, thank you for joining.
seconded. What was Severus's impact on the Antonine Wall? And was it really ever going to be worth putting that much effort into Scotland? Yeah, was Scotland worth it?
Two-part question. First part is, it would appear as though Severus, at least on the stone-built forts on the Antonine Wall, did refortify them because they were useful to secure his rear while Caracalla and he were campaigning in the Upper Midland Valley. So it looks as though at least the stone-built forts on the Antonine Wall were rebuilt. Was Scotland? That's a very big question, you know, Joe. Very big question. In my new book, Agricola, which I've just finished, that we chatted about earlier and comes out next year, as well as my Severus book, I make the case actually that parts of certainly the lowlands of Scotland are as fertile as parts of the north of Britain, which were in the Roman province. Certainly some places in the Scottish borders, and certainly Fife. So actually, I don't. Although economically it may have been a fair distance to go without the political imperative, I also think one of the big factors why the Romans never conquered the far north of Scotland is because they found it very difficult to integrate the natives of the far north of Britain into the Roman way of life, because they just weren't interested. They absolutely weren't interested. They were happy to take the Roman wealth. They were happy to take, this is the elite, happy to take the favour of Rome, happy to take military support when it helped them against the neighbours. But I just don't think they were interested at all in buying into the Roman way of life. I actually equate them in my Agricola book to the rebellions in the Jewish revolts, where the Jewish rebels also just were not interested at all in buying into the way of Rome. So I don't think it was so much economic, it was other things as well. And one of them was the fact that the natives in the far north just proved really, really, really tough opponents over and over and over again.
Thank you. We've got another online question, then another question in the room. The online one first. Why was he such a good general and such a good campaigner? Is there any evidence of that, or was it just his use of overwhelming force?
I think actually he was the best sort of warrior emperor. He surrounded himself with really experienced military men who he listened to. Even Caracalla, who I think was verging on being psychotic, actually, even he on campaign was fairly successful. And again, because they surrounded themselves with really, really experienced military men. And also remember, he was lucky, Severus, because he'd inherited, it's like Philip II creating the Macedonian army, then Alexander the Great inheriting it. Severus inherited, when he went to Pannonia Superior, probably the best troops in the Roman known world at the time, the legionaries, auxiliaries who'd won the Marcomannic Wars. So maybe a bit of both. Good emperor, good track record as a military leader, surrounded himself with fantastic military advisors who he listened to, with great troops as well.
I have a question. You briefly mentioned like his heritage. Other than like stuffing the empire with his own people, what else, like what some other big impacts did that bring?
Well, it's a very good question, actually. The key thing first was, I can't overemphasize the importance. The key thing was putting people he trusted from North Africa into positions of power. And remember, he became the emperor at the point of a sword. So therefore, having become the emperor at the point of a sword, he needed to have people around him he could trust, because he could easily be usurped against as well. But also, there's a very distinctive architectural style associated with North Africa in the Roman world, which I've seen frequently on my travels to Africa, which you also see beginning to appear in Europe. See it in the Temple of Elliott, for example, in Rome. You see it, I've mentioned already, in Carlisle. I mean, how far away from the center of the Roman Empire, Roman imperial center, can you get than Carlisle? The vaulting tubes which spread the heat the roof of the bathhouse in this building are of a North African design. If you go to the museum, in the new museum that's opened in the Forum Romanum in Rome, you can even see the household Lari, so the household gods that people worship, being styled in a North African style with a North African hairstyle. And it's writ all across, and even Julia Domina is famous in the modern world for having this hairstyle, which was adopted from North Africa. So it underpins everything about the Severans, this passion for their roots.
Thanks, Simon.
Great question, by the way.
Another question from online. Hi, Simon. It's from Louis, I think. Hi, Simon. Do we have many details on how the Caledonians actually fought? I read recently that they used a lot of cavalry, which I found surprising.
And that's Louis who convinced me, Joe, to actually dress as that Roman legate. How you doing, Louis? Which I very much enjoyed, by the way. So the Caledonians, let's say the Britons of the far north. It's easier to use a catch-all, right? The Britons of the far north, it would appear, fought in a very similar fashion to the Britons of the south before the Roman conquest of the province. So they did have a chariot riding aristocracy. They did have light cavalry riding small ponies. They did have sort of a feudal system of recruiting troops who normally farmers into a line of battle infantry who fought with a spear, a dagger if they were lucky, a shield, and almost certainly no armor or helmet. They had slingers, very few bow and arrows, and javelin men as well. So they were very similar, I think, to the Britons in the south who'd been conquered early by the Romans.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? I'll have one question then before we wrap up. I know historians typically don't like hypotheticals, but if Septimius Severus had not died and had succeeded in sort of continuing to campaign in Scotland, and I guess we don't know whether he would have wanted to, how might that have changed British history?
Absolutely dramatically, in the same way that if Domitian hadn't ordered Agricola back down from the far north, having conquered the far north himself, again, these are real two sliding door moments in British history, in my mind. With the Romans not staying in the far north, from that point, the far north goes its own direction. Forget England and everything, that's much later. But from that point, the far north goes in its own direction politically, and we have that division still today. And I think Severus, to my point earlier, did want to conquer the Scottish borders, did want to conquer Fife, and did want to conquer the upper Midland Valley, up to, on the Highland line, it's probably Stonehaven. And I think they would have been incorporated into the province in the south. They would have then featured a Mediterranean-style stone-built urban infrastructure, as you have in the south, and an integrated Roman road and maritime transport network, as you did in the south. So I think it would have been very, very different. It's a really important inflection moment in British history. Great question, by the way.
Thank you. Okay, last chance for anyone in the room. Otherwise, I think we will just say Hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Simon Elliott for a fascinating talk. Thank you, Simon.